Perfect timing with the bell. All right, so we're going to move into 9.3, Unit 9, which is going to deal with community relationships. And we touched on this briefly in 9.2 when we talked about bacteria and the root system of plants, fixing nitrogen in order for uh, plants and animals to be able to use nitrogen. So we're going to look at some of these other community relationships or interactions between organisms. So the vocab term for community relationship is, of course, the interaction between organisms in a given community. It could be positive, could be negative, could be neutral, and it could be multiple different ones at the same time, depending on which side of the coin, so to speak, you're looking at. So a symbiosis is a close long-term interaction between two organisms. They do not necessarily depend on each other, but at least one depends on the other. So there's different types of symbiotic relationships. The first one's going to be commensalism, and this is when one species benefits and the other one gets nothing. So an example is the cattle egret that sits on top of cows, and it eats the insects that are drawn to that cow. The cow isn't bothered by the insects, so it really isn't receiving any real benefit, but it is a easy food source for the egret. Instead of it having to go out and find the food is brought to it. So the plus is the positive interaction of the egret, and the zero is a neutral effect on the cow. Another type of symbiotic relationship is a mutualism, so two positives. The best example of this is the clownfish and the sea anemone. So the fish gets protection from the stinging tentacles of the anemone, and also gets food. And the anemone gets cleaned daily, and I typoed that bad. So the anemone gets cleaned daily by the clownfish eating the waste of the anemone. Next type of symbiotic relationship is parasitism. So it's a plus and a minus. And this is when one species benefits and the other one loses resources. So the host organism isn't going to be killed, but it has its resources drained by the parasite. And this is the big difference between parasites or parasitism and predation. So the example in the picture is the tomato hornworm and a type of wasp. So the wasp is going to lay its eggs into the caterpillar, and when these eggs hatch, they feed on the inside of the worm. Competition. So a competition is a contest between two species or within a species for resources, and we've talked about this before. It could be over food, water, territory, mates, etc. And this is going to be a negative interaction between or for both organisms or for all organisms involved. Interspecific competition, and so this is competition between two different species. For example, in the picture, hyenas and lions typically fight over the same food source or same kill. Intraspecific competition is competition within the same species. And the example here is longhorn sheep fighting for mates or territory. And so with intraspecific, we typically see fighting between males for mates or for territory. Predation, we said it's different than parasitism, and this is when one organism kills and feeds upon another species. So one organism is going to be benefited and the other organism is not. Predator-prey relationship. So a predator is the species that is doing the killing, and the prey is the species that is going to die. Boom-bust cycles, and this is the relationship between the predator and prey's population. So as the number of prey increases, the number of predators will also increase in response to this, more food. Okay, this will cause the number of prey to decrease, which will be less food, which in turn will cause the number of predators to decrease. So there's a relationship between the two. More food available, more predators can be produced and sustained. Less food, predators will die off. That's, the long story short, what a boom-bust cycle is. So population dynamics is the study of how populations grow and decline and the factors that contribute to that. Population density is going to be the amount of a population in a given size or given area. Density-dependent factors are typically biotic factors, and these factors depend on the size of a population. And so a density-dependent factor, let's take the picture down here for the wildebeest as example. So if 1,000 wildebeest are going to cross a river that is full of 20 hungry crocodiles, there will be less of an effect on that population of wildebeest than it would be if only 20 wildebeest cross the river with 20 hungry crocodiles. If the less number or the smaller number that crosses the river, the less that will survive, and the larger number that crosses the river, the more that will survive. So density independent factor are abiotic factors, and these factors have an equal effect on an organism regardless of population size. An example of this is forest fires. So forest fires are going to destroy everything in its path, regardless of the population size of organisms. Doesn't matter if there's 10 or 100, those organisms, right, population is going to be affected the same. Growth rate is going to be the rate at which a population grows, and this depends on the birth rate in comparison to the death rate. So birth and death rates, different organisms are born and die at different rates. You have immigration, and how it's spelled is the difference between the meanings. So immigration with an I is when an organism moves into a new population, and immigration with an E is when an organism moves out of a new population. So I in, E out. Exponential and logistic growth. So exponential growth is when a population doubles continually, likely due to it having no limiting factors, and is also called a J-shaped curve. So it's the blue line over here in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. This blue line is a J-shape. Then the logistic growth is when a population doubles for a time, then it's going to level off as it reaches a limiting factor. It's also called an S-shaped curve, and this is the red one. So with most organisms, we see the logistic growth, and humans being an example of the exponential growth. Carrying capacity, also signified as a capital K, and this is the amount of a population an ecosystem can support. So this is also a great example of a limiting factor. So its ability to support a particular amount is dependent upon the limiting factors acting on a population. The carrying capacity of an ecosystem can change as limiting factors change. If a population remains above the carrying capacity for too long, the ecosystem can become damaged and actually lowers the carrying capacity, which could cause a population to crash. Humans have grown exponentially for the last 1,000 years as we have eliminated certain limiting factors. In turn, humans have taken their toll on the biosphere. And that is the end of 9.3. There is a forum, and if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.